Okay, hello and welcome back to Heads and Tails. I'm Henry Faber. I'm one of the co-founders here at Oppidan, and today I'm tuning in to the Middle East, to the UAE, to Dubai, the center of the universe, to speak to Alan Williamson, who is CEO of Talim. To give a little bit of background on Alan, I think things began a long time ago in the chilly winters of Glasgow University, and now he's found his way to the year-round sunshine of Dubai. Alan's journey to leadership's taken him from a history and Russian degree to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and with plenty else in between. What began as early teaching experience in the Shetland Islands took Alan progressively or over time south through headship and leadership roles in UK schools and multi-academy trusts. And then in 2016, Alan took on the headship of King's School Al Barsha, and via a stint as their CEO at King's Education in the UAE, he's now moved and been at CEO of Talim since 2019. Alan is responsible for a whopping 34 schools, around 38,000 students, and I think more than 4,000 team members across the UAE. So it's a real privilege to learn from his wisdom and experience and hear about the amazing innovation and all exciting things that are going on in that part of the world. So Alan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Henry. And with an introduction like that, I'm actually looking forward to hearing myself speak, I have to say.
Good, excellent. You know that we are mad about all things mentoring. That's what we do. And no doubt you've had some amazing mentors along the way. Do you have a mentor? Did you recognize the role of a mentor formerly when you were growing up? Any perspectives on mentorship would be gratefully appreciated.
Yeah, funnily enough, I don't have a coach, but I'm aware that I do encourage that in our younger leaders. I was really fortunate, as so many of us have been, to have family mentors. My dad didn't go to university, a working class man, but educated through the church and through school, and absolutely desperate for me to go to university, and really pushed me in that direction. I also had an uncle who was a Royal Marine, and perhaps later, one part of the journey you missed out was a sort of early stint in leadership in the military. I also had great teachers. Yeah, I didn't have a huge number of great teachers. I don't think, sadly, when we reflect back, that many of us do. But I had a couple of teachers who inspired me in sport, in rugby union in particular. And I actually reflect back and think that's maybe where a lot of my leadership came from being part of a team sport, and maybe excelling a little bit. Don't want to blow my own trumpet in that field, but I think that gave me confidence. Interestingly, when I went to the Shetland Islands as a young teacher, a senior leader in the Shetland Islands, a man called Stuart Hay, really inspired me into school leadership. So I think he was the first person that tapped me on the shoulder, and I think so many of us have had that tap on the shoulder and say, look, what you're doing with young people in the classroom, you can make a bigger difference if you move into leadership. And I think finally, I mentioned for my original CEO here in Dubai, who tempted me out of the UK to come to Dubai. And again, he made that difference between school leadership and executive business leadership, and inspired me into that direction. So very lucky that from sports to military to family to career, I've always been lucky enough to have leaders who I've looked up to and learned from. And as with all leadership, you often learn the do's and don'ts. It's sometimes, and I would never say this is great, but occasionally I've been in the education business for 35 years, and occasionally we meet leaders who we think, I don't want to be like that as well. None of those mentioned thus far.
We'll leave them for the next conversation for sure, or one for Chatham House Rules. Perhaps I'd like to learn a little bit more about Alan the teenager. Maybe there's an anecdote from school that gives us a sense of what kind of a student you were and how that's helped you become the person you are now.
a hard worker, and I think without over exaggerating it, not from sort of an independent school background, ironically now leading some of the top independent schools in the world. But I think one person you gave in your introduction the Russian part of the story, Я говорю по-русски, and I had an amazing modern languages teacher, and there's a story behind that, who inspired this young lad who was more interested in rugby, to be honest, than academics, and also grew up in a world without mobile phones and social media, slightly dyslexic. I now diagnose it and reflect back. So I wasn't an A-star student, but I was definitely a sort of A-B student from hard work, and fell in love with languages. And this teacher inspired me and took me on a school trip in the early 1980s to Moscow and Leningrad. Really, the first time I'd traveled internationally. And he is the reason, that teacher is the reason why I went on to study Russian, joined the military at university, and was inspired by that. And at the same time, I loved history, and again through an inspired and passionate history teacher, and went on to teach history and a bit of language. The call for Russian wasn't always massive in schools, but I was able to teach a bit of humanities, a bit of languages, a bit of history. So I think one of the other things at school is there was a moment where, probably in my sixth form, where learning all came together. And sometimes in the modern world, post, that was the 1970s and 1980s, teachers now encourage interdisciplinary learning. And I remember at A-level where the Russian, the economics, and the history all came together and made sense for me. So as a young learner, I guess schools in those days were very silo approaches to subjects. And I remember being in sixth form thinking the language, the history, the economics, the politics, it all now makes sense. And I grew up in a part of Scotland that had a massive Royal Navy base next to our school. And as I said, my uncle was in the Royal Marines, and probably one of those gentlemen that you looked up to. And I was also in a uniformed organisation called the Boys Brigade, and I think that all came together and set an aspiration for me above where some of my peers were going. I think I was also lucky that I played rugby union, to be honest. It's a strange story. May make sense to some of the listeners, but most state schools play football, play soccer. But our state school played rugby, and that also took me into another friendship network where my friends wanted to be doctors and lawyers, and that also inspired me to go to university.
A lot of lovely stuff there. I mean, as a modern linguist myself, not with Russian sadly, but with some Hispanic languages, that sense of like opening up experience and experiential learning and bravery and adventure and all those things that I think in some ways we're losing as we deprioritize languages. So
That's
great
a
to
that's a
great
huge topic.
yeah, huge topic. Great to have a linguist on the call. So thank you. No doubt a career as varied as yours, and with so many different places you've worked, has had some amazing highs and probably some massive lows too. Education always does. Perhaps you could share with us just a high and a low that come to mind. There'll be so many, but perhaps an Everest and the depths of despair by equal measure. Something you're happy to reflect on from those two extremes.
Yeah, I'm getting old, so actually my memory going back is quite on. I've taught in some fantastic schools and some schools in tough realities. And, I think anybody who listens to this who's taught in, a state comprehensive and a tough reality will have hilarious stories, but also stories where staff and leaders and teachers really this concept of teacher efficacy and leadership efficacy. Do you genuinely believe, and I still talk about this, that your children can achieve the highest grades? And I think some of the success stories would be around headship or principalship in some of these tough realities. I was always very fortunate to have great leaders in my team. And one thing I always say on my leadership journey and on anyone else is that you should always appoint people that are better than you underneath you. And it helps to create a team that come together. So I taught in a school called Hoyk High School. Quite hard to pronounce if you're not from Scotland. And that school gained status of School of Ambition. That would be a high. Here in Dubai, because it's fresh in mind, I think your failures and your challenges are actually so important to your leadership development. And whenever I've listened to a podcast or listened to one of the greats when they speak, whether that's in the education world or the sporting world, they never would change what went wrong. So, because the learning that you take from, failure is so important. And even if you had the chance, you would never go back and change those adversities. So we actually lost a school rating from outstanding here in the last 5 years. Been in Dubai for 11 years now, and that was tough, especially in a world of for-profit education, and you've got a fantastic but challenging board of directors. And especially now we're on the stock market, so you have to declare these results, and that dented my pride, and it should never be about your pride, but the learning that has came from that, both for the school but also for me as a reflective practitioner, was really powerful.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, God, such extremes, isn't it? From the classroom, the small daily wins of actually being a teacher and working with young people, to these sort of macro, massive, seismic shifts across like scale where no individual child's name is anywhere near the issue at hand. It's such a spread, and I'm sure both come with their ups and downs. You mentioned podcasts, so we'll go into some content. Always interested to see how people get their content. Are you a reader? Are you a listener? When and how are you getting that content? Where do you find time for it? And perhaps there's something you can recommend us.
Well, I think my sporting background has always provided time. Ever since I did a military regime at 5 a.m. in the morning, I've never stopped that, and I listen because of that slight dyslexia to so, and plus I'm reading so much at my work on a daily basis. So I love going for a walk, going for a run, going to the gym, and putting a podcast on. Um, Obviously, and you'll be so familiar with it, Henry, Legacy, by James Kerr. So many of your podcasters that have been on your show will say that. I think the All Blacks are an inspiring concept, and if nobody listening has read Legacy, I would say it's a game changer. Whether you're a teacher, whether you're a chief executive, or in any line of work. I don't think any teacher should set out on their career without watching Dead Poets Society. If you're not inspired, if you're not in tears at that film, you shouldn't be in teaching. And I remember watching that as a young teacher. Probably looks very, very dated now, but when I was a young teacher, that was inspiring. Podcast High Performance for certain. Jake Humphreys used to be in the world of sport. I'm addicted to that podcast. It's got business people, mainly sporting people, comedians, everything. And they ask some tremendous questions that I actually started our in service for all our leaders across 34 schools, American, IB, British, French curricula at the start of this year. And they say, what is high performance? I think it's important for all teachers, leaders to define what that means in your context. And then what are your non-negotiables? That's down to your values. You'll never change things that you're willing to tolerate. And that was something said to me. Another great phrase was, you don't have to be sick to get better. I love saying that to our schools, just because I'm asking you to reflect on your performance doesn't mean you're sick. You can still get better. And, I love, they always ask the celebrity, it could be Johnny Wilkinson, it could be, a famous CEO, what is your greatest strength and your greatest weakness? And when I'm meeting leaders, so often your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. And I think these are great questions from that podcast.
I love that. You don't have to be sick to get better. I think that is a fantastic line. I spend my days trying to help people understand mentorship, and I think that fits so neatly with that. There's this sense often, it's a very British thing too, to think, oh, there must be something wrong with me, or how are we medicating or sort of curing something that's wrong? And if there isn't something wrong with me, I don't need it. And that idea of striving for more, I think, is so prevalent and needed.
Yeah, a shout out to Brian McAlinden for giving me that. And I was a very, very young head teacher. I got into headship by this tapping on the shoulder at a very young age, and he was the head teacher of Castle Milk High School. And if you're familiar with Glasgow, you'll know that's a tough reality. And I remember him meeting me an early part of the career, and he gave me that. And he's like, and whenever you're speaking to your staff, and it feels critical, please, you don't have to be sick to get better. I'm not down on you. I'm saying whatever we are doing, we can raise up. The David Brailsford incremental improvement. We can always do a little bit to get better.
We've all got to push for that 1% a day, and 365% a year sounds pretty good to me.
Absolutely.
Perhaps there's an unpopular or controversial opinion you're happy to stand up behind. I know education can be complex and controversial at the best of times, but interested to know what you've picked for this.
I love this one. It would have to be listen to this. Technology is not the future of education. I am a dinosaur. And I had the pleasure of doing a bit of work for HMIE and inspecting schools. And so many teachers in Dubai are amazing. As you said, the innovation, the classrooms, the resources that we have here, and all the teachers listening to this from the UK will be so apologies for that. But I actually read, I think it was yesterday, that the Swedish government are going to spend 100 million euros putting pens and paper back into school, and I smiled. For me, learning to read and learning to write, and the wisdom that comes from that is so important. And I'm actually, I was a secondary specialist, not a primary or kindergarten foundation stage specialist. But my favourite part of the school, whenever I have the honour and privilege of being in one of my 34 schools or any other school in the world, I love being in that sort of year 1, year 2 classroom. And these year 1 teachers, for me, that's still the hardest shift in the school, but
It's God's work. It's God's work.
it is learning to read and learning to write is still going to be the fundamental success, phonics, etc., of a child's education. And I have been absolutely criticised left, right, and centre, especially post-COVID and during COVID, the rise of ed tech. Ed tech, the future is ed tech. Children won't want to go to schools. People won't want to go to their offices. Everything will be at home. But what we, and I can't speak for England, what we learned here in Dubai is what children and parents missed was the science lab, the sports pitch, the theatre, the drama class, and actually working together. But what they also missed is the basics of education. And for me, arithmetic, reading, writing, it's Victorian. And people say, you're a dinosaur, Alan. But honestly, I'll never stop saying that. Technology is not the future of education.
I actually think it's a lovely thing. And having listened to a podcast just this week on dopamine addiction, scary to hear that even just the motions of going on our phone or going on our computer to use our notes just to write something down in a digital format rather than to use a pen and paper triggers a sort of, it feels the same as if we're getting the notification high from a dopamine hit. And I think it's been exactly the same, pushing away from those kind of ingredients back to things that require more thought and introspection and less immediate connectivity. I think is probably no bad thing. I think we'll leave it there, Alan. I think you've given us, I was going to ask you for a piece of advice on the sector, but you've given us so much advice. So perhaps a parting thought would be great. But I'm very grateful for the time you've shared. We're really excited to hear about the plans with Harrow and Talim. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of an update on that before we finish. It would be great to hear from you on how that's been going.
Yeah, we're super excited to bring the Harrow School to the UAE. We'll be opening a Harrow School in Dubai in 2026 and a Harrow School in Abu Dhabi in 2026 as well. Absolutely, I was lucky enough to work with Rugby School in the UK for a bit, which was an amazing school. And a shout out to Patrick Derham, who was the head teacher at that time. And again, it was actually looking at scholarships for students for disadvantaged background. But when I went to Harrow, the 7 prime ministers, it was just amazing. And the team there, Alistair, who's the head, have just been amazing to work with. So we're super excited about that. That tip for anybody thinking about teaching or leading, for me, it's love your job. I am the luckiest man in the world, and I genuinely mean that, Henry. It's that, old Mark Twain saying, I don't know if he actually said it, that, if you find a job that you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And for me, teaching is still a noble profession. It's still a vocation. It's still something that your heart's in, and working with children is the most amazing thing in the world. I actually, when I interview secondary teachers, I always say, are you a teacher of subject or a teacher of children? And you've no idea how many historians, physicists will say that, the most important thing to me is teaching chemistry. But for me, the answer to that question is I'm a teacher of children. And if you love, and I use that word, and that's a very difficult word for a Scottish man to use. If I use that word, if you love children, you'll never work for a day in your life. You'll just love your job. And as I said, the privilege for me is not being on the financial market. It's when I go into a school and go into that year 1 class and surrounded by beautiful children. It's the best job in the world.
And what a lovely place to finish. You've been very generous with your time, a lot of great wisdom there. I love the parallels across the sporting world and your military background and through to school, both in teaching and leadership. So there's a really wide range of great things for people to listen in. So thank you. We're excited to track Talim's progress and your professional progress too in the next few months and years. And thank you for all the time you've shared.
Thank you, Henry. Pleasure.